I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This year's Oscar nominations were recently announced, and as expected, one of the most nominated films, alongside Oppenheimer and Barbie and Poor Things, was Killers of the Flower Moon, the Martin Scorsese film based on the 2017 book by David Grann, former guest of the podcast. Given that the movie is now available to stream on Apple TV+, and since the paperback has been back on the top of the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while now, it seemed like a good time to talk about both. And who better to do so than A.O. Scott, Tony Scott, the Times' erstwhile film critic of almost a quarter century, who has since moved over here with us on the Book Review as a critic at large. Tony joins me this week for a deep dive discussion on both the book and the film. If for some reason you're worried about spoilers, whatever that actually means in the context of literal historical events, watch the movie, read the book, come back and listen, save this episode for later. For those of you who have done one or the other, please do stick around. Tony Scott, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Very nice to be here, Gilbert.
Is this your first time on the show since you officially joined the Book Review last spring?
Yes, it is. I used to come on the Book Review podcast occasionally when I was a film critic, just as, I guess, a little side gig when there were books to talk about. But this is my first appearance as a fully credentialed book critic and member of the New York Times Book Review staff.
Excellent. I've been deficient in inviting you on. All apologies. I have a few questions before we jump into talking full bore about Killers of the Flower Moon. I need to ask you, this is your first Oscar season in 25 years, I think, just about, in which you're not covering it for the Times. How are you holding up?
It's actually very pleasant. In a way, part of the job of being a film critic is caring about the Oscars, or at least making a convincing display for the readers of the New York Times of caring about the Oscars and of knowing about the Oscars and of having predictions about who might win and opinions about who should win and all of that. And it's very liberating to have that burden lift. To be allowed not to care about the Oscars is a wonderful thing.
Now, I love movies, and I think I love movies in a serious way, but I also like the Oscars. And I always thought that people who loved movies also liked the Oscars. Did you find yourself forced out of something that you used to actually enjoy?
I mean, in a way, I always liked the Oscars, but there's a way that they're taken seriously that I think has had some not great effects on the movie business and on the whole kind of discourse about movies and on the behavior of some movie critics and film journalists. So the whole idea that there's a science to the Oscars, or that the Oscars represent anything other than Hollywood's opinion of itself, is sort of a problem. When people put too much weight on the meaning of the awards, or when the awards become the only chance that a movie has to get talked about, to get noticed, that frustrates me. So I was frustrated with the Oscars in that way. Whereas the silliness of it and the trivia of it and the spectacle of it is and has always been a lot of fun. And just wondering like how the host is going to mess it up this time, or the non-host, or just watching to see if in the 4 hours of the spectacle, anything interesting is going to happen. And it's a funny kind of thing because they engineer the show to be as boring as possible. And then every once in a while, something happens that kind of catches everyone's attention. And, oh no, it's La La Land, it's Moonlight. And all of a sudden it's fun and crazy, which is what it always should be. But for some reason, the way that Hollywood wants to take itself seriously and be taken seriously, they pull against that a little bit.
Now, usually your October and November leading up to you writing your top 10 list alongside your former co-chief film critic Manohla Dargis, I believe was madness. It was absolute insanity for the two of you. How does one decompress from so many years of experiencing an art form in that way? And do you even watch movies anymore?
I do watch movies and I enjoy, but if I want to watch one movie a week or no movies a week, or 3 movies a week, or 2 movies in a night. I can choose. And if I want to wait and see something later, or if I want to, like a normal person, read the reviews by my excellent colleagues, Manola Dargis and now Alyssa Wilkinson, and read the reviews and say, you know what, I think maybe I'll skip that one. I have that wonderful privilege, which most of the world's population also has. So it was this frenzy, really, you're absolutely right. From the fall festivals, from Telluride, Venice, Toronto festivals on, it was just this cascade of dozens, scores, literally hundreds of movies, all of which had to be seen and processed, a number of which had to be reviewed, but then also had to go into the hopper for the year-end lists, for the award speculations. And it's not a good way to see movies if you care about movies, to see 12 a week or 15 a week, or to get, a stack of streaming links, or in the older days, DVDs, and just spend a whole weekend, 48 hours, just crashing through them one after the other. It's much better to just queue up your Netflix or your Apple TV or whatever your streaming service is, or go with your friends or your spouse or your family to a theater and get some popcorn or some nachos or whatever and watch a movie. So I've rediscovered all of the ordinary pleasures of moviegoing.
Before we turn to Killers of the Flower Moon, I do have one more question, which is, now that you're on the other side of this, maybe you're watching a movie after it comes out and after other critics have written about it. Maybe you've read some of those reviews. Has it affected the way in which you receive a movie or think about a movie? Many people turn to critics either to help them decide what to watch or to help them figure out how to think about a movie. You are used to being ahead of the pack. You're seeing movie weeks in advance, months in advance, maybe. Have you found that you are affected differently in the way you experience a movie now that you're actually reading stuff about it maybe beforehand?
I think there are 2 things that are different. One is that often, because I have always enjoyed reading film critics, and that's one of the reasons that I became one, was because some of my favorite writers were film critics. And so I often do read the reviews, or some of the reviews. And so I have sort of one thing that I think those reviews do, reading reviews, is provide a framework or a set of talking points, things to look for. I don't think that reviews necessarily influence whether I like or don't like a movie, but they do. And this is what I tried to do when I wrote them, just suggest, here's some things that might be interesting about this movie, or that you might think about. The biggest difference, I think, in the experience is that whenever I would go to a movie for most of the last almost 25 years, I would be aware of the deadline and aware of the obligation to generate copy about this movie, whether you want to or not. I mean, I would always think I'm just going to sit here and let the movie wash over me and just, absorb it. But you always start, you know how it is when you're writing on deadline, you start writing in your head as soon as you can. So you're coming up with a lead or a structure to your review before the final credits are even done. And so, I've seen a bunch of movies that I have a lot of thoughts about, but there's a great pleasure in just kind of letting those thoughts wander and not worrying about how to organize them into a piece, so not to have to do that. I've seen a bunch of movies that I have a lot of thoughts about, but there's a great pleasure in just letting those thoughts wander and not worrying about how to organize them into a piece. So I went to see Poor Things, for example, a very interesting movie with a lot of ideas and a lot to think about. And I enjoyed thinking about it, and I've had conversations with various friends about it, but it's much more relaxed because I don't have to have a position on this movie. I don't have to have an argument. I don't have to channel all those thoughts into 1,200 words of coherent, spoiler-free prose.
Okay, well, let's turn to Killers of the Flower Moon. And I think I should give a little setup here. The book, as we said, written by David Grann, and the movie directed by Martin Scorsese and written by him and Eric Roth. They ostensibly both tell the same story, but with quite significant differences of emphasis. So the spine of both is the, quote, reign of terror. And these are the murders that swept through the Osage Nation in Oklahoma in the early part of the 20th century. The Osage is a tribe that, following the Louisiana Purchase, like many Native American tribes, was forced out from its ancestral lands. And over several decades, they were made to give up nearly 100 million acres of land. They were pushed out of Missouri, they had to go to Kansas, and they were pushed out of Kansas and eventually settled in Oklahoma. Once in Oklahoma, they discovered that the land that they occupied, which was thought to be of no value, sat above a giant reservoir of oil, a fact that made members of this tribe incredibly wealthy. And as a result of their ownership of this land, each member of the tribe received shares in the wealth, what they called head rights. You couldn't buy head rights, you couldn't sell head rights. They only passed from one member of the family to another, including to those who married into the tribe, like the many white men that we see in the story in the movie do. And around the early 1920s, several members of the Osage tribe started to die under mysterious circumstances. They were shot, they were murdered, investigations were perfunctory, several succumbed to something that they called wasting disease, which was likely just they were being poisoned. And the story focuses on the family of Molly Burkhart, whose sisters and whose mother all die within a relatively short time. I'd love to start with the book because I think that this is a really fascinating piece of adaptation. So, Tony, when did you first read the book? And you reread it before this conversation, correct?
Yeah, I read it shortly after it came out. David Grann is just a terrific writer, and in a kind of, I don't want to use the phrase murderer's row, but in a kind of a great stable of New Yorker nonfiction writers, he's one of the best. So I was interested in that. And also I actually have some family in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, and I visited there a few times and had learned some of the history and had heard about, in addition to the Tulsa race massacre and the murders of the Osage, there's quite a gruesome but also fascinating history of that part of the country. So I was interested in that. And I'm always interested in history and in American history and in the history of the West as someone who's been fascinated by Western movies. So there was a lot that kind of attracted me to the book, and I read it and enjoyed it, and then it went into the pile of things that had been read. So it was very interesting to reread it just in the last couple of weeks preparing for this conversation and in the wake of having seen Scorsese's adaptation of it, which, as you say, is a very different creature. It's the same story, but it has such a different feel and texture and gets you thinking about different aspects of the story.
In terms of the adaptation of it, what stood out to you? Because hopefully listeners have either read the book, seen the movie, or ideally done both. You know, the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part talks about Molly's family and the murders that occurred during the Reign of Terror. That lasts about 100 pages. And then David Grann goes sort of full bore into the law enforcement investigation, the early history of the FBI, tells a story of the lead investigator, who in the movie is played by Jesse Plemons. And then the third part, a first-person account of David Grann's travel to the region, to Oklahoma, talking to some of the descendants of the Osage tribe members who were murdered, as well as some other people who tried to help the Osage who were also murdered. So it really is a book in 3 parts, whereas the movie focuses almost entirely on that first part.
Yeah. It's interesting because the subtitle of the book is The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. And that whole second section, a lot of it is about J. Edgar Hoover and about the professionalization of law enforcement in America, about how it had been a very kind of local and very unsystematic and very corrupt undertaking until the 1920s. And for various reasons, noble and also not, Hoover turned the Bureau of Investigation into the FBI and into this sort of modern professional crime fighting force, using things like fingerprints and different forensic techniques, and coming in and overriding some of the incompetence and corruption of the local officials. So in a way, that's an old-fashioned movie there about heroic law enforcement coming in and solving a crime and bringing to justice the perpetrators, which is not the story that Scorsese is telling in the movie. And then the third part is a sort of, as you say, is a first-person narrative of David Grann's trying to uncover the story and uncovering in a way. And this is, I thought, a very moving part of the book, the sense of just how widespread these murders were and how many more probable murders there were. I mean, the ones that are dealt with in the Burkhart family that are dealt with in the movie were pretty well, there was a trial, they were widely publicized in the press at the time, but he discovers the haunting evidence of many more. So one of the things about this head right system was that many of the Osage were declared incompetent to handle their own affairs, and so had white guardians appointed for them. So if they wanted to access or spend any of their oil money, which belonged to them, they had to get the approval of the white guardians. And Grann finds this evidence of how many of the guardians, how many of their wards, of the people they were supposedly protecting and guarding, died under their guardianship. And it's just, it really sends a chill down your spine. And there's nothing provable there. It's beyond the reach, certainly, of justice and law enforcement, and even almost beyond the reach of history. So you get this sense of the shadowy background against which all of these sort of better known and proven murders happen. So in a way, I think what Scorsese does is he takes that shadow that comes at the end of Grann's book, which has been, in its first two parts, a true crime narrative and then a law enforcement story, and folds it into this very intense, very compact, even though the movie is quite long, but it feels very packed narrative of what happened to Molly Burkhart and her family.
The official count for the number of deaths was 24. I believe that's the official count. But as you note, in that third part of the book, David Grann really presents an argument that there were likely many more. And it ends the book on a very dispiriting, disquieting, I don't know which is the right word, note, because ostensibly you've read a book about a crime in which the people that committed the crime were punished. Ernest Burkhart, who's portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie, goes to jail. His uncle, William Hale, portrayed by Robert De Niro, goes to jail. But instead of that being the thing that you're left with, Grann leaves you with this, as you say, the shadow of a reality that there were probably many more. Those people are never held accountable. Their families will never see justice.
Right. And so in a way, the instead of it being about crime and punishment, it's about a much larger crime and no punishment. And this enormous murders in that were done in the service of this kind of greed and racism to take. I mean, there's one point in the book where, an Osage elder, I think is quoted, is said they pushed us onto this pile of rocks in this corner of Oklahoma where they figured no one would want to live, and they just put all of the Osage there. They drag them out of Kansas and put them there and say, fine, this is yours. But then once it was discovered that land was actually quite valuable, there was this conspiracy to take it back.
So I don't know how many of our listeners know this, but I think maybe people have read interviews with DiCaprio or Scorsese might be aware of this, but the initial conception of the film was one in which Leonardo DiCaprio was going to play the Jesse Plemons character, the investigator, the white hat who was sent by J. Edgar Hoover to solve these murders, Tom White. And at some point, they decided to radically reshape the emphasis of the film. Instead of playing the ostensible hero of the tale, DiCaprio flipped to playing the villain, who's still the point of view character of the film. I'm curious as to how you think that switch in emphasis sort of changed the story that was in the book to the story that is in the movie.
I think it really makes it, in a way, more unsettling, because in some ways the way the structure of the book works is this terrible thing is happening, and these awful people led by William Hale, who's a kind of fascinatingly monstrous figure who presented himself as the great friend of the Osage and,
King of the Osage Hills.
King of the Osage Hills, and was this very wealthy and had built himself up into a very cultured and polished and powerful, but also elegant and sophisticated figure, was behind this reign of terror. And in a way, in the book, you have the villains, and then, the white hat comes riding in, and it's Tom White, former Texas Ranger, now working for the Bureau of Investigation, who's described in Grann's pages as the most upright, honest, decent, which he probably was. There's no reason to doubt that he was. But in a way, in the movie, then it becomes a kind of a white savior narrative, right? So I think what this does, and what makes it a Scorsese movie in a way, is that it's a very close, very intense, uncomfortably close study of a structure of evil And people say he makes mob movies, he makes mafia movies. That's not quite right. What he's often been interested in, I think going back pretty far in his career and certainly evident in Goodfellas and then more recently in The Irishman, is how it works, how violence and corruption and cruelty organizes itself into a system.
Tony, one of the things, and maybe this is just me being completely unsophisticated or being tricked by the fact that Robert De Niro has played many members of the mob, as he did in The Irishman, is that when he is sitting with his nephew or when he is approaching him and saying, if you get sent to jail, don't worry, I'm going to take care of it. I was like, it feels like a mob boss just transported, into 1920s Plains America.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and in a way, De Niro has played enough of these characters and has studied this character type. And one of the pleasures of watching the movie, and just I think of watching De Niro at this stage in his career, is how many different nuances and inflections. He's not just playing the type. He's not playing the same character that he's played before. So just the way that this guy is so friendly and so cheerful and is such a kind of a chamber of commerce type boosterish guy with his little glasses and his bow ties. And of course, because it's De Niro and it's a true crime movie, you feel all of this sort of suspicion and trepidation, but it's also kind of a lot of fun to watch the darkness of that character emerge.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined by Tony Scott, erstwhile film critic at the New York Times, who's now a critic at large for the Book Review. We are talking about David Grann's book, Killers of the Flower Moon, and the Martin Scorsese and Eric Roth adaptation that was just nominated for 10 Oscars. Tony, in talking about the Scorsese film, one of the things that watching it a second time really stood out to me was a theme that good Catholic Martin Scorsese has hit so many times in his life, which is guilt. We see the movie through the point of view of Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Ernest Burkhart, who from the very beginning is presented as a not very smart person who is roped into his much smarter uncle's scheme to take the head rights from the Osage women, but falls in love, at least as is presented in the film. And David Grann writes a little bit in the book, actually, about how people really did think they were in love, despite the fact that Ernest did this evil thing to his wife. But as the film progresses, you see this sort of dumb person realize that he is doing something bad, yet he loves his wife, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And there's a remarkable scene, almost 3/4 of the way through the movie, in which William Hale, Robert De Niro's character, is burning his fields for insurance money, and Ernest takes a little bit of the poison that he's been giving Molly. And it's this sort of, to me at least, it was a psychedelic moment where Ernest really starts to realize what he has been doing to his wife and realizes that maybe it's time to turn himself in. But this theme of guilt, which winds itself through so many Scorsese movies from the very beginning, from Mean Streets, is so omnipresent here. It's a personal guilt. It's Ernest Burkhart's guilt, but it's also, I presume, American guilt.
Absolutely. I mean, there is this sense, part of the weight of this movie, and part of what I think makes it different from a movie like The Irishman or a movie like Goodfellas, in which the guilt and the criminality and the corruption is contained within a subculture, within an already criminal subculture. I mean, these are mobsters. How do you expect them to behave? But these are not mobsters. These are civic leaders and businessmen and politicians and doctors. And the guilt belongs not just to them, but I mean, the guilt, right, belongs to white America and spreads out in every direction. It's also not just located. I mean, this is a particular horrific and lurid and sensational example of the murder of indigenous Americans, but it's not as if it's the only example. And what's fascinating to me, just given that Scorsese is such a student of American film history, and particular, I would say, a kind of a follower of John Ford, maybe the greatest director of Westerns in all of Hollywood, is that this movie is very much in dialogue with the Western and the Western tradition, and is pointing a finger of accusation and spreading some of that guilt onto Hollywood itself and onto the whole myth of the West, which is partly a myth built on the dead bodies and on the graves of countless Native Americans.
What are some moments or some scenes in the film that you feel like demonstrate that dialogue that he has with classical Westerns?
I think part of it is the attention that he's trying to pay. And there's been some criticism of the movie, that it doesn't go far enough or that it's inadequate, but to the Osage and to the experience of the Osage and to the culture of the Osage. So there are scenes, of the gatherings of the elders of the Osage trying to talk their way through, where you're seeing the story very much from their point of view. And they're trying, as political leaders, not just as victims, but as political leaders with some agency, to figure out, what are we going to do? This is the situation that we're in. We've been kicked out of our homes. We're here. We have to deal with these people. We have to figure out what kinds of resources we have and are going to use. And that I thought was very effective and felt like something a little bit new. And I think also the performance of Lily Gladstone, who plays Molly Burkhart, who I think has been properly nominated for a Best Actress Oscar that I think she has a very good chance of winning, is also, she pulls the center of gravity of the movie in a way that it is right. DiCaprio is the point of view character, and he does a very good job of, I think, being an idiot, of convincingly portraying, just as you say, the guy is not too bright, and he's neither a good guy nor a smart guy, but he's a guy that we're with in this story. But she's something else. She falls in love with him. In a way, it's Lily Gladstone that gives him credibility in our eyes. So some of the early scenes of their courtship, I think when she first invites him home, when there's this kind of like tenderness and innocence and everything, a little bit already about everything that is going on around this, but there's a quiet of her house and the way they're just in it together, you almost have this romantic idea that some other thing is possible, that, maybe this is going to be okay, or maybe it's possible in a world that's defined by violence and greed and cruelty for two people just to find each other and just to live.
It is a very meaningful scene that comes early in the film. It is the scene in which, I don't know if you remembered, but there was one image of the film that I feel like had been going around for 2 years.
Where they're around the dinner table. Yeah.
Lily Gladstone and Leonardo DiCaprio sitting at the table, and everyone was like, What is this movie going to be about? And then when the scene actually arrives, it is, as you say, a tender scene full of meaning. She tells him to sit and listen to the storm, that he doesn't need to be someone who's just flapping his gums all the time, that there is meaning in silence, and that in her culture, especially, the power of a storm is something that holds great value to her and her fellow tribespeople. But it is also, in that scene, I remember there's a moment where he says, I don't like whiskey. I love whiskey. And he also says, as he says many times, I love money. Like, this is a man who is almost not hiding his intentions, the way that it's presented in the film.
Yeah. And I think that DiCaprio does a very good job of being charming, which he is, but not overselling his charm. I mean, the character Ernest Burkhart is described in David Grann's book as someone who has the handsomeness of an extra in a Hollywood movie, which I thought was a wonderful way to describe someone who's going to be played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who's the absolute opposite of an extra and has a kind of charisma and magnetism that is without equal, but who plays a kind of a muted minor key, kind of slightly messed up, disreputable version of that. But you can see he's charming, he's funny, he's lively. Molly, is also quite witty herself. I mean, she gets off some pretty good jokes in the movie. And you also just get the sense that this is the world of northeastern Oklahoma at this time, where it is this sort of almost anarchic sort of scene where there's all this money, there are all of these different kind of motives and motivations, and it's a little bit, you feel right from the beginning like everything here is just a little bit out of control. And that's actually precisely what William Hale, who's much smarter and more Machiavellian than his nephew, is going to figure out how to exploit.
It is amazing to see Scorsese, a director who is considered to be as you say, a great director of crime movies, of mob movies, of movies that take place in New York City and urban environs, really relocate to a completely different landscape. I mean, there are two landscapes here. There are the plains, which we see in this amazing widescreen cinematography, but there's also the dirty, hectic town of Fairfax at its train station, where we're introduced to Leonardo DiCaprio's character as he comes off a train, fresh from the war, and it's just this boom town in which people are drunk and it's full of violence. It's sort of like the early scenes of Gangs of New York almost. And it reminds you that whether it's a film like that or a film like Silence or a film like Kundun, Scorsese has always been able to operate in these different modes, these different settings.
Yeah, and really immerse the viewer in them so that you feel like you're not in a sort of in a kind of a Hollywood costume drama. You feel like you're in this place, that you can almost smell the smells and hear the sounds. And I mean, I think a lot of credit for that goes to Jack Fisk, the great production designer. And this is just working at this scale and for this long. I mean, I don't know how many years Scorsese was living in Oklahoma. I mean, this was a very long and elaborate production, but it pays off in just that sense of granular detail that, you know, if you see anything in this movie, if you see the smallest brand of shaving powder or whatever it is, that was probably what was really there.
You're absolutely right about Jack Fisk, the production designer. If listeners are curious, they can read a great profile of him that ran last year in the New York Times Magazine. Longtime husband of movie star Sissy Spacek. They met on the set of Badlands many years ago. Great profile. You should all check it out. Tony, I'm curious about your thoughts about the ending in particular, which I think is something that some people find incredibly moving and some people find a little baffling. I'm not talking about the very last shot, the one in which there's a radio show. Martin Scorsese appears, as does oddly Jack White of the White Stripes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that fits into the themes of the film.
There was such a radio play. It's mentioned in Grann's book. But I think that this is a rare and for that reason moving meta moment in Scorsese. I mean, Scorsese is not, even though he's steeped in the history of film and has famously based some of his shots on some of his favorite shots from Italian movies and classic Hollywood movies, is not a sort of self-conscious, self-reflective, is not somebody who makes movies about cinema in a way. And I would say that this is a commentary, a kind of meta commentary, if you want, on storytelling, on what happens when you turn history into a story, when you turn atrocities, such as the murders of the Reign of Terror, into entertainment and the inevitable distortions and erasures that happen when you do that. So this is an attempt 20 some years after the fact to tell the stories of these murders in the medium of the time, which is radio, and in a kind of a sensational and dramatic way. And in some ways that radio play is the ancestor of the movie that we've just seen. And in a way, it's what makes it, I think, moving, and what makes it moving that Scorsese himself appears in it, is that it's a sort of a gesture of humility. He's saying this story too, the one that you've just seen, my version of this same drama, is also going to be flawed and partial and compromised and imperfect. And that's just what we have. That's what we have to deal with. When we're trying to make narrative out of human experience, we're always going to risk getting it wrong, or we're always going to do it through the lens of our own times and our own prejudices. So in a way, we have to both extend the benefit of the doubt to the storytellers, but also be willing to subject them to criticism. So I found it as someone who has written a lot of criticism of Scorsese, positive and negative, and who has been made aware that he's been sometimes thin-skinned about the criticism that he's received. There's something about this gesture at the end of this movie, coming at the end of this movie, a movie late in his career, that seems very generous and humble and inclusive. And so I found it moving on that level, as well as in terms of the way that it stepped back from and put in perspective the story itself that we had just seen.
Would you recommend that people who watch the movie read the book, or vice versa? Like, are these two things that should be taken in concert?
I think they're both worthwhile in their own right. I'm not sure that one necessarily depends on the other. That is, I don't think you need to have read the book to see the movie. I think sometimes it might be interesting to do it in reverse, which is sort of how I did it this time. I mean, I had read the book before, but my memory of it wasn't super sharp. So I came to the book after and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And having a comparative sense of them was interesting. But I don't think it's a case where one is obviously the better version.
Sure.
Or where you need one to unlock the other. They both stand on their own, and they also each pays tribute to the other. Both David Grann and Martin Scorsese are pretty good at what they do.
I mean, again, as an active adaptation, it really is astonishing. There are big moments that are made small, and there are small moments that are made big. I really feel as if the movie builds Leonardo DiCaprio's character's motivation almost out of this one little graph, and this is the graph. And by graph, I mean paragraph, listeners.
That's newspaper jargon.
That's the way that we shorten it here. Grann writes, Burkhart never admitted having any knowledge that Molly was being poisoned. Perhaps this was the one sin that he couldn't bear to admit, or perhaps Hale had not trusted him to kill his own wife. It's a very brief graph, but I feel like it is the nugget for a large part of DiCaprio's performance.
I think so. And I think it's one of those fascinating things about that sometimes happens in Scorsese's films. I think it happened in The Irishman too, is that you have a character who is in no way sympathetic or admirable and is not held up as anyone to like or admire or identify with, but who nonetheless has a soul and whose soul in a way is at risk, is at stake in what they're doing and how they're understanding what they're doing. And in a way to take someone who is just a schmuck, to use a word from Scorsese's King of Comedy, another great one, and to say, but just, you know what? This person also has moral value in the world because they do have a soul. And you shouldn't necessarily care about them or in the sense of empathizing or sympathizing with them, but you have to acknowledge their humanity. And that's a very powerful thing. I mean, in the way that films really like to sort people, Hollywood movies really like to sort characters into good or bad, likable, unlikable, worthy, unworthy. And to say, well, here's a character who deserves nothing but your contempt. And yet we need to care about the state of his soul. I mean, that's another kind of side of Scorsese's sort of residual Catholicism that's very powerful in this movie.
Well, the book is Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. The movie is Killers of the Flower Moon, directed by Martin Scorsese. I also urge our listeners to go back and read the Times' review of the movie, which was written by Manola Dargis. You can go back and read the original review of the book, which incredibly was written by Dave Eggers, is the person who reviewed it for us. And if you haven't experienced both, I urge you to do so. Tony Scott, thank you so much for finally, I've only put out 1 million invitations, coming on the Book Review Podcast.
It was my pleasure, Gilbert.
That was my conversation with Tony Scott about both the book and the film versions of Killers of the Flower Moon. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.